Can't complain.
Okay.
I should have put my
I left my charger in my office and it went down at the meeting.
Yes, ma'am. That'll be great. Yeah, that'll be good. Because I got some work I gotta catch up on. Yeah, I'm with this training. Yeah, that'll be good. Okay, yeah, we got these trainings that be about 2 hours. So that's 2 hours of office that I'm gonna miss. I need to be with it. Yeah, that's good. Okay. I'll call and text when I leave.
It's a training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I can have to put it up and see which one I'm about to say that. Today, nonprofit ambassador and strong nonprofit groups. So,
You gotta be.
I don't see Robert. And they did. I'm be okay with it too. And I gotta set up for the Purple Box project tomorrow, and I gotta go finish making my boxes.
Some pretty earring.
This one? Oh, God, thank you. I forgot. Yeah. These are old. I thought it was like a turn. Yeah. Thank you, girl.
Who made your head, Tony?
Huh?
Who made your head?
Miss Nick, same woman that I've been going to for years. Remember when we was there?
The lady who we used to go to North?
Yeah, until these days are.
I wonder could she bring my hand to this style right here?
What you got? I just got mine rebranded.
And how much she would charge me? I want this.
That's cute.
That's cute.
Text me that. What? Yeah, I'm gonna send that to her. Okay. She said we don't have to pay. No. No, I was gonna ask her. Oh, it's a different number.
I don't think so. That page right here.
It came up at 761-977.
That's my house number. How does that look like that? That's weird.
Cause that's the what number is this?
Well, that's still my number. You must be got both of my numbers. Click on it. It's both of them probably.
It ain't even registered as a saved number. But yeah, now see.
Yeah,
So where is it?
that's my home number.
Okay, and so but it okay, it can't
That's my
have
cell
this
number
one.
right there. But yeah.
So it's in here, but it's not saved as a contact. See what I'm saying? Your number was
Maybe you got a new phone and it didn't cross over.
And this one is a newer one. Because like you said, I knew I had your number. That's like, oh. And that's one of the few numbers that I memorized. Hello.
Hi.
How you doing?
I think it's supposed to be well.
That's a cute bottle. Alright, so I'll see what she's got texted to me.
It's us.
Yep, so it's all recorded and get this loaded up, we're good to go.
I need to make a couple of changes. If I can.
Sure. Maybe be at 1 second. Hello, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
Take a second. To I told you these are tiny.
Yeah, I told you it's 10, but,
Oops. Christ. There.
we are about to sign it,
Okay.
but, just email it, you know. That's your true.
Okay, yeah, I can. Sorry, mistake. Okay.
Okay. Good to go. Okay, thank you folks for coming out, and thank you to you folks that are online watching, tuning in. Today's course will be on nonprofit capacity building and building strong nonprofit boards. I'm pretty sure all of us, we know the important functions of a board, and you know that your organization is only as strong as your board. So Douglas White, he's actually a very published author. He's going to be bringing forward some concepts and some good practices to help you go about your organization and building capacity as you go forward. We talked a little bit earlier about some transparent practices with nonprofits and just any organization really in general. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in. I'll check periodically to see if there are any questions that we can answer.
Yeah, thank you. And it's good to have you here, and it's good to be here back in Baton Rouge. I was here some months ago to present this for the first time, and since then, a lot of things have changed, and I've added a lot to the conversation. I tend to do that when there are things going on in the world. I tend to ask how we can incorporate this, because in addition to knowing what we should know from a book or a textbook perspective, we should know what's going on from a real world perspective as well. So I want you to feel comfortable asking questions as we go forth, and you will not derail me at all, so don't feel like there's a reason to wait. I've divided this into two basic parts. One is where you're going to hear about how things should be from a textbook perspective and what we've learned over the years from board governance and its activities relating to the organization itself. And then the second part is more, it's ethics driven, it's also real world driven, I have some real-life examples that we could talk about. And I'd like you to kind of give some thought to this, because this is not a paper process. It's a real-world process. And many times when we talk about, or we teach board governance, it's a little sterile. It's not quite, in my view, real. So let's begin, and we'll see where we go, if we're okay with that. What I'd like to do, first of all, is ask you the two questions that I oftentimes ask when I'm talking to boards. We oftentimes go into a board's situation. And the first one is that, somewhat existential. How would the world be different if you didn't exist tomorrow? Like, what would happen? You wouldn't believe the number of boards, or the number of senior staff who cannot really provide an answer to that. Now, I don't want to make it sound as if I give them a gotcha moment or anything like that, but you would think that they'll give more thought to what their impact is on the community. Hello. Thank you for coming. I'm not quite, by the way, so you'll just know that. And so the question is, what would be different? You know, who cares if you're not around? And that's one of the big questions I think that we should all ask ourselves rather frequently. And secondly, what do you do that makes a difference? Like, what is the tangible result, one tangible result that you can point to because you exist? Now, in general, nonprofits exist for a reason. They exist because government and business don't do the job. Have you ever heard of the term the third sector? Well, that's what we call the nonprofit world, the third sector. Business and government, business and government, or government and business being the first two. And I think that the word third sector, the phrase third sector, came about because there was a hole in terms of the way the world was reacting to the problems of society. Now, let me just take a quick break. Would there be a possibility of getting some water before we?
You take your time. Oh.
You'll have to forgive me. I'm coming. It seems like everybody in the world has had a bad cold this past week, and I'm coming off of one. So the operative phrase is coming off. So now we weren't doing this yesterday. We would have done it. I've done it when worse, but I feel great by comparison. But still, my throat will get a bit dry. So forgive me for that. So the question is, can you actually say how you're helping your community? Did you feed enough homeless yesterday? Did you increase the number of people you fed? That's the second question. In the first question, if you closed your doors, would the homeless people that you're feeding, would they go somewhere else, or would they starve? Things of that nature that I think we all have to look at ourselves from a kind of a 30,000-foot level and say, what good do we do? And as a board, we're responsible for actually answering those questions. Many people don't know this, but there are legal duties associated with a board. And before I go further, let me ask the three of you, because I didn't do this at first and I should have, who you are and where you're coming from, what organizations you're representing and what you're doing with those. So let me start over there.
Sure. Tony Jackson, I work here in the College of Business at Southern University, business development coordinator, a lot of fundraising, outreach,
Yes.
External affairs, and I also have a nonprofit and looking to start one more.
Really? Excuse me again. Excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mary Cobb Marshall. I work in the College of Business as well. I work with the online program, and the MBA program has a board. So this would be something interesting to actually learn about, to know how we can actually help our board members to understand, more about our program of study at Southern University.
Excuse me. I'm going to, because I have such a rotten memory, I'm going to write your names down again. So forget it. Give me a
Tony, T-O-N-I,
T-O-N-I, T-O-N-I.
Jackson.
Okay. And
Mary Marshall.
Mary Marshall. No, those aren't hard to remember. It's just not one. Okay, and now.
My name is Chantrice.
And Therese?
And I'm a student here at Southern University, getting my master's in public administration with a concentration in nonprofit and public policy. So I'm taking this course as just kind of additive to kind of learn more in depth on a nonprofit level.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. And we have a new person into the profession and a couple of people have been around in the profession for a while. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And again, this is my elixir in life. Later on, it's going to be bourbon, but this really works well now.
You're to that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Robert. Well, I want to also point out that the board is not the front-facing group of people at a charity. Normally, when you think of a charity and who runs it, you're thinking of the executive director or the president, somebody like that, the CEO. We'll talk about some organizations where that might be familiar to you. But if you're talking about Southern University, the front-facing person is the president of the university, right? Everybody knows him or her. Let me just ask. And his name is?
President Chancellor Ray Belton.
Ray Belton. So, he's the CEO, really, of the organization. But he has a whole board behind him, okay? And they're the ones who are making decisions as well. Now, he has to be really involved with them. In fact, oftentimes, that person is also a member of the board. The CEO is also a member of the board in most organizations. Sometimes that person does not have the ability to vote on matters. Sometimes he or she does. Most of the time, I would say that's not the case. But he's a member of the board, a real member of the board. And the reason for that is that he is so instrumental in making what goes on at the university or any charity happen. So this is the role that the CEO plays with regard to the board. The CEO is really then the person who's the spokesperson for the organization. Okay? So that's how that works. You could tell me in a minute the president, but could you tell me the number of people or the names of those people who are on the board?
A few.
A few. Well, that's because you work here, okay. But in general, if you were just living here in Baton Rouge,
Correct, you would.
knew or you were a donor, you wouldn't know those people. That's the nature. Hi, can we say hello to you?
Hi, I'm Jasmine Banks. I work here on campus at the College of Business.
Okay, well, thank you for coming, Jasmine. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you.
I'll just pick this up here, get that out of the way. Try to remember everybody's name, and I know I'm going to forget, so I just write it down, okay? Okay. So, as long as we know that the board is at once invisible and extremely important. That's the key thing. And do you think the board members get paid a lot? What do you think they get paid?
In gratitude.
In gratitude. Of course you're joking, right? What do you think they get paid? You have no idea, do you? You can look at the books and find out. Well, if you looked at the amount, the filings with the IRS, you would find out that what they get paid. And what you would find out is that they do get paid in gratitude and nothing else. And that's typical. I don't believe there are more than 15 or 20 boards in the United States who actually, nonprofit boards, who pay the people who sit on them. And the ones who do tend to be medical facilities who need specific, very technical knowledge to run the board. But you don't find that to be very often the case. So boards don't get paid a lot. They don't get paid anything. They do it out of love for the organization they're working for. Nonetheless, they do have legal duties. So here they come to a job. They're recruited usually by being told that there's not much to do. Okay, we can come to a few meetings, maybe a few committee meetings during the year. That's the wrong way to recruit a board, by the way. The way you should recruit a board is to be very frank and honest about what the role of the committee member is, or the board member is. Still, they have legal obligations. They have to play by some rules. And those rules have been made clear by Congress and the IRS. Duty of care is the first one. There are 3 rules, 3 duties. Duty of care is the first one, which means to take care that you're making judgments that are in accordance with the organization's best interests. Okay? Pretty simple. This means using good judgment and common sense. Sometimes that's in short supply, but most of the times, these guys and gals take it very seriously. What would an ordinary, prudent person do in a similar position under similar circumstances? That's the kind of thinking that needs to go into this process. And this is another important part of this. Ordinary care may differ from director to director based on their background and experience and the role they play in the organization. So if you have someone on your board who's a big fundraiser, and you have someone else on your board who's an accountant, they would come to a question differently with regard to, let's say, a donor, or how to communicate with a donor. Neither one is necessarily right, and certainly neither one is necessarily wrong. Bringing your different perspectives is important. That's what boards should be, people with different perspectives. In addition to duty of care, there's something called the duty of loyalty. You put the interests of the nonprofit before everything else in your life. Well, that's a tough one. He or she should reasonably believe the action will benefit the nonprofit. The nonprofit, not himself, not his family, not his friends. Doing what is best for the nonprofit means being loyal. Its interests prevail over the director's personal or business lives. It means that the directors adhere to the articles of incorporation, bylaws, tax-exempt status, and faithfully following its mission and purpose. Bylaws. That's basically your governing constitution. That's the organization's governing constitution. So it will say, for example, this is how many board members we will have on our board. This is how many times we will meet. We will have goals for this kind of diversity, things of that nature. They're governing themselves through this document. And so everybody should have an article of incorporation, which basically is run and approved by the state in which the organization is incorporated. This is not a federal issue. Let me just divert for a moment and just discuss the difference here between federal and state oversight. We think a lot in terms of the IRS, which is a federal agency. And the IRS, when we think of that, we think of what? Taxes. So when we make a deductible gift to a charity like Southern University or Southern University Foundation, we think of how the IRS might react to anything that goes wrong. And the IRS does, in fact, give the foundation its tax-exempt status. That's a process. In order for a charity to exist, however, it needs to go through a first step. Because what the IRS is doing is they're saying, okay, this organization can be tax exempt, but it needs an organization to say it's tax exempt. That organization is born in the state, okay? So people will incorporate in the state, like Louisiana, and then they will apply for the tax exempt status from the IRS, okay? They say they're going to be a tax exempt organization in their articles of incorporation to the state, and then they then apply to the IRS to say, okay, will this pass muster? Now, how likely do you think it is that most organizations will pass muster? Excuse me once again while I deal with this. How many people, excuse me, how many organizations, on a percentage basis, don't get accepted every year because the IRS says no? Any thought on that?
Substantial.
Substantial? That's a good start. Substantial? What would you think? You're brand new to this. What do you think? Do you think the IRS is going to say no to a lot of organizations?
Yeah.
You think they would? Okay. How about you? Say likely that they'd say what? No? To a lot of, yeah. No. So what are they looking for, do you think? They're looking to make sure that you're going to be pursuing a tax exempt purpose. You know, like education or science, the arts, the environment, public policy. But the answer to the question is that about 98.5% of organizations are accepted each year. In fact, about 15 years ago, there was an article written by students of a class in Stanford called Anything Goes. Robert Reich was the teacher, different Robert Reich from the past cabinet member for Clinton. He's a teacher out there, and his class did this program called, it's a nonprofit program, they did this paper called Anything Goes. And it would be interesting for you to look it up, because anything does go. They found out some 10 really, well, they found many, but they highlighted 10 crazy missions, like nuns for being transvestites, that kind of thing. There's a group that the IRS said is okay that had that as a mission. So now, why is that? The reason I said this is not to talk about the nuns, but the point is that it's all very difficult to not be political. The IRS is not political in this question, so it doesn't matter what the public purpose is, as long as it's tax exempt, as long as it follows some very broad guidelines. So you have organizations throughout the United States that compete against one another, that are really in opposition in their views of the world. That doesn't matter to the IRS. And that's good. That's a good thing, because we can't have one kind of government dictated approach to these things. And then what happens is the organization then goes out to the world and explains its mission and asks for money based on that mission and its execution of that mission. And then we see what happens. A lot of charities go out of business every year too. They're too small, they don't have enough money, so many go out of business as well. How many organizations are there in the United States? How many tax exempt organizations are there in the United States? Any thoughts?
Couple 100,000.
Couple 100,000? Good start. What do you think?
I'm gonna stay with my safe word. A substantial number?
It's a substantial number. Okay, go ahead.
I think a lot too. I think it's quite a few out there.
I'm not hearing numbers here. When I'm asking for a number, I expect like a number. Substantial, quite a few. You're the closest to a real answer here. I know, you're all kind of winging it, like, okay, hedging your bets. Any thought?
I was thinking close to 500,000.
Close to 500,000. Well, let's understand any thoughts?
Is this including churches?
Wow,
I didn't even think
let's
of that.
go down that road in just a minute. Either way, go ahead.
Well, with the 500,000.
Okay, 500,000. We're kind of centering in on the $500,000 level. So, a couple of things here. When we say nonprofit, there are about 15 or 16 different categories of nonprofit. Okay, like a political action committee is a nonprofit organization. Okay, your Chamber of Commerce is a nonprofit organization. So there's an umbrella, and so that you'll understand it, would fall under what's called the 501c category. Okay? 501c. And then within the 501c, there are some 20 or so categories. And one of those is, and you just said it, 501c3. Now, we hear 501c3 a lot for a reason. That's where all of us fit. That's where all of the charities fit, and foundations, by the way. So, 501c organizations, you're talking about 1.7 million. 501c3, a little over 1 million. So about twice as much as the 500,000 organizations that you thought was pretty substantial. So there are a lot of charities in the United States. Very few of them are financially sustainable. I would say perhaps 10%. Many of them are very, very small. But charities have to file a form, it's called the 990, to the IRS. And that is not a tax form. Even though it goes to the IRS, and people sometimes think it's called a tax form, it's not a tax form. It's an information return, which means that it has information about the organization. talks about its mission, talks about who runs it, has a list of directors, it has a list of all of its assets and that kind of a thing, but it's not a tax form. It's the 990, and it gets filed every year, or should be. And smaller organizations can file a simpler version of it. Like if you have not a lot of complications on your own taxes, you can file something called a 1040EZ. Something similar for charities. Okay, I'm digressing a shade here because I just want to give us all a sense of, kind of some of the structure here, and I'll do that as we go further. But I want us to have a good grasp of the nonprofit world from an organizational perspective. At any rate, getting back to the duty of loyalty, a board of director member must be loyal to his or her organization. And later on, I'm going to show you examples where that might not be the case. And finally, the duty of obedience, which means to ensure that the organization complies with federal, state, and local laws and regulations. That's pretty obvious, but all of them are obvious. What's interesting is that I am not aware, and I've looked, so I think this is correct. I'm not aware of any board member or board in general that has ever been called on the carpet for the violation of any of these things. What I'm getting at is I'm not sure that there's been no violation of any of these things. In fact, I know there has been violation of these things in some cases, but the IRS really doesn't regulate this much. And why not? Look at the way it's been written. All these three things are all very vague and very broad. How do you take someone to court? How do you stop someone from being a charity on the basis of violating something that is so broad? So, on the one hand, we say these are important duties, and they are, and anybody who violates them, in my view, should stop being a board member. But by the same token, it's very hard for the for the IRS to really dig into that and find out if there are any violations. Board oversight. This is the phrase that we hear a lot. And I'll go through this rather quickly. It's, like I say, the stuff that's on paper more than it is in practice. Legal and ethical oversight. Take a minute to read that. This comes out of Independent Sector, and Independent Sector is an organization of charities. This is a different way of saying these three duties. The three duties are something you should all know, even though I feel like they're not as enforceable. But here we're talking about it in more depth with more clothing on it. And so we say, we want to run this place in accordance with our mission and for the reason we were granted tax exempt status. Management oversight. I mentioned a moment ago about how the president of the university answers to a board of directors. Well, it's important to know that the directors really have oversight responsibility to the senior staff, which includes the director. The board selects and defines the role of the executive director and then supports that person. This perhaps is the most important aspect to everything in my view. Without a good relationship between the executive director or the president, and let me just divert again, the executive director, president, CEO, these are all titles that can essentially mean the same thing, but different organizations have different ways of just putting titles together. But it's the president of a university, it's always been that, but he's effectively the same role as the executive director of another charity, same level of authority. But that person has a relationship with the board, and that has to be very important. That has to be very good. If it's not very good, then we have problems. This is the thing that gets talked about the most. How many times do you find out that the executive director or the president spends all of his time, or a lot of it, raising money? okay? So he or she has to be sure that the budget comes in clean, that we understand where the money goes, where it's coming from, and what our proposed 5 years or whatever is going to look like. In this sense, nonprofits are very like for-profits. We sometimes talk about how they're different, how much they're the same, and there's lots under each category. This is one that they're very much the same. Just because we're a nonprofit doesn't mean we can't be or shouldn't be diligent when it comes to our money. The boards also have a great deal of say over the program activity at a charity. So if you wanted to have a new history department here in Southern University, that wouldn't be decided only by the history department chairman. That would be decided by the board of directors. Why? Because there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, and I'm going to get more into this as we go forward, but there are different ways to look at this oversight question. It's not just legal and ethical oversight, and it's not just management. It's also looking at who we are, who we want to be. Again, coming up, we'll have an example of an organization that did this, and some of the risks and issues that resulted from that. So board has some risks to take into account here. I was just upstairs visiting with your endowment, the person who runs the endowment here, or at least is in charge of making sure it's kept accurate. The financial risks of an organization are awesome. If you run into too many deficits, as anyone in any number of years, you could run into the danger of closing down your business, which is your operation. So a board member has to say, okay, I'm going to make this decision based on what I expect to happen, and that expectation should be made prudently. For example, if you have a need for a $1 million budget, and your fundraising is $500,000 per year, it has been. Do you keep that budget in hopes that you'll raise the money, or do you bring your budget down to $500,000 so that you can have a budget in accordance with your past fundraising? That's not an easy question, because it might seem obvious that you bring down your budget down to $500,000. But bringing your $500,000 budget down to $500,000 might mean that you would cut an important program or cut some important people. So these are not easy questions. But if you don't bring it down to $500,000, then you run the risk of not raising the money you need and then running into a deficit. You're spending money you don't have. You do that enough times, you're out of business. Okay? So even nonprofits can go out of business. These are very, very important questions. And what makes it even more interesting is that many of the people who sit on boards are successful business people. They're brought on the board because of their stature in the community and their ability to serve, as well as their dedication to the mission. So these are important but not quantifiable issues for the most part. And yet, what made them successful in their world had to do a lot with taking risks. It's part of being in business. They tend not to bring that mindset into the boardroom. So they bring in two different hats, the one that we're wearing outside, and now they have one inside. So these are crucial questions for a board to take a look at, or any board member. And then there are, of course, legal risks. Up at Columbia, where I worked for some years, we had a woman who claimed that she had been raped. You may have heard about it. She, of course, this is going on a lot of campuses, but in this particular case, after the administration didn't do enough, in her view, to investigate, she carried a mattress around with her every day for the final 2 years of her career at Columbia. She walked around campus with a mattress, her mattress, as a statement of protest. So the question that the Columbia Board of Directors had to face was their investigation of the allegation enough? And it was a mess, believe me. I don't believe anything tangible has come out of that, except that we should be more aware of it. But legal risks are everywhere. In fact, and this is true at Columbia, it's probably true here just as well, the General Counsel's office is very busy with questions that come up with how the organization should be run. we'll talk about reputation in a little bit too, but reputational risk is really the only asset you have. Reputation is really, your work. If you don't have a reputation, you're not gonna get any students, you're not gonna get any donors. Your reputation is everything. Charities have to know that. Reputation means everything. Question is, do you want this story to run in the front page of the local newspaper tomorrow? Are you gonna do things to violate that? So in order to address those questions, a board has to do these things. This is probably the most geeky I'll get today with you, so just stay with me for another 60 seconds or so. You have to identify any misconduct and basically do something about it. Something must happen. You must report it to the right person. You must have an idea of what that misconduct might be. And you have to have policy in order to make sure that you have a roadmap to deal with things. Now this, like I say, is the geeky part, and I get it, so don't drift away too far. I'm not going to stay here. But this, as a whole, needs to be addressed by a board. Okay? It's not fun. It's not even understandable in many ways. That's why you should have an attorney counseling your board, and it would be really good if you had an attorney or two on the board, especially small organizations. I'm involved with an organization right now, which is fairly small, and we wanted to have an attorney on the board because we have these kinds of questions. We had a situation once where an employee was at a bar. This was not during office hours at all. And he approached someone to just, approach the other person. And that person made a complaint to our board because that person felt this was an improper activity. So here's the guy, he's not on duty, if you will. He's going to a bar where people typically are friendly with one another and it's a pickup scene sometimes. Nothing really illegal about that. Oftentimes it's a good thing. But you have to be very careful about offending someone if you're the person at the organization that has a responsibility. So if you're at the CEO level, you have extra concerns. And as a board, you have to be able to monitor that.
So was it someone that worked for the organization that you tried to pick
No,
up? Or
no, it
just a
wasn't.
random person?
Yeah. Now, interesting you bring that up, and I forgot your other point that I wanted to bring up too. I'll come back to that about churches.
Churches.
But it was not a person who worked for him, because that would create another issue.
Right.
Okay? No, this was just a person who felt offended. Okay? As it happens, to make it a little bit more real world, the CEO, who was a man, was hitting on another guy. But that's not uncommon these days. It's like, okay, I've had that happen. I don't want to say that it's happened often because I don't want to sound like that much of a catch. But that's happened. I used to live in Washington, D.C. I live in New York City. Hey, come on, be real, right? The answer is, no, thank you. Now, if after the no thank you takes place, there's more, then there's an issue.
Right.
But really, come on, it's the real world. But the point is that the board has to be really responsive to this stuff. It's not just dry textbook stuff. It's real, and you never know what's going to pop up in the news or in communication or whatever. Anyway, risk assessment goals. You have to look at that and say, okay, what do we want to do? There's this book that I use quite a lot. It's called Governance is Leadership. And it's available, but it's very expensive because it's been a while since it was published. But I got it about 10 or 15 years ago, just so you'll see what it looks like. It's available on Amazon, but I don't think it's out of print, but it's, for some reason, far too expensive. But it's worth it in the sense of what I believe it tells us. And what we're gonna spend the next little bit of time on is something called the fiduciary, strategic, and generative modes of government, or governance. Because a lot of times people think, well, there's a lot to being on a board, but what do we break that down into being? So what we're gonna do is have a different view of organizations. And this is important too, that we recognize this, that organizations don't travel a straight line. You know, you say, okay, we're going to accomplish X in the first year, we're going to accomplish 2X in the following year, we're going to accomplish 3X in the following year after that. Tea and honey couldn't be better than elixir, so I'll just go with that. Thank you. My wife will thank you too. We have to understand that the route these boards, these charities go through, very much like in life. You're too young to know this, but I'm going to tell you something you're going to have to know 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That is that when you graduate from school, you have an idea of what you want to do and who you want to be. And there's no other way to do this, but you have an idea of how that's going to go year by year, or at least, you know, this is what I want to be in 5 years. This is what I want to do in 10 years or something like that. Sometimes I don't go out that far. Sometimes I go out farther. But the point is that in all likelihood, that's not going to happen. That doesn't mean you shouldn't think that way, but you also have to understand that's probably not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because what happens? Life intervenes. So any kind of a 5-year plan that a business puts together or a nonprofit, for the most part, it's not going to happen. But it's important to do because the intellectual exercise that makes you think about things is good, and that's useful. But that said, your career is not going to go as you think it is, and neither are yours. Mine isn't, and I'm old, and I'm still going to come up with something next year. Something's going to happen that I'm not aware of. So it doesn't go the way it says it's going to go right here, from vision, mission, goal, strategy, execution. We put it down on paper that way, but let's be open to other options. So that's part of what the board has to understand, is what I'm getting at. Secondly, a different definition of leadership. What does leadership mean? That kind of question is thrown around a lot. I have my approach to it, but there are about 100, maybe 1,000 other approaches that are as good or probably better in some ways. But here's one. Leaders enable an organization to confront and move forward on complex, value-laden problems that defy a right or perfect solution. So understand that when you have a problem in front of you, and this is why I devote the second part of this to ethical dilemmas. Here's a dilemma. You're not going to always find agreement on what the right solution is. You might find there's a consensus on how to go forward. That doesn't mean it's always the right or the perfect solution. And I'm not saying right here as opposed to wrong. Sometimes you don't know what the right solution would be. A different mindset. Organizations need to have a different mindset from the one most organizations have right now. Boards do. Because lots of people on boards think it's a top-down process. We tell the executive director what our thinking is, and he just goes and does it. A little bit like fundraising. A lot of organizations will hire a fundraiser and say, okay, go raise the money and come back in a year with money. That's your job, right? Well, the problem with that is, and a lot of boards think that, I know I'm simplifying it, but a lot of boards think that. The problem with that is that fundraising is a collaborative exercise. That's why the president is so involved with fundraising these days. 25 years ago, that wasn't as much the case. Today, a lot of his time is spent on fundraising. Why is that? Because he is the spokesperson for the organization. And finally, a different role. The board becomes an asset, not just the top layer of an organization. That board becomes an asset so that the organization can move forward. Did I use the word playful in here? Absolutely, and why not? Don't we need to have a little bit of playfulness in our lives, even on the most serious of questions? Not just linear and logical, but playful. Think of something kind of a little outside of the box. A different notion of work. I love these. These are just like, and every organization can take it and interpret it differently for its own use. But different, different, different. That's the key thing here. It's not the old standard top-down activity. The board relies more on retreat-like meetings and teamwork and discourse, robust discourse. Keep this retreat-like meeting phrase in mind as we go forward. Now, before I go further anymore, I want to just address the question of churches. Did we finish the? Yeah, we did. Okay, so let me just go back because you had asked about churches before. Churches are charities. There's no doubt. They enjoy charitable status. If you give to your church and you're able to deduct a gift because of your own tax situation, then it is a deductible gift, just like it is to the university, just like it is to any other charity in the United States. The difference, though, and there is a difference, churches hold a special status in the nonprofit sector. They do not have to file a 990. They are exempt from filing their financial information. This means that if you want to find out about the finances of a church, you have to go to the church and have that organization be okay with you knowing them. But there's no obligation on their part, like there is for other charities, to tell you what that is. As a result, the IRS doesn't have a firm handle on how many churches there are in the United States. And as a result, many people have declared themselves or their small organizations to be churches. That sometimes raises some questions. And this is a constant fight. One big fight is not so much the status of the church, but its activities. Charities, as you may already know, are not able to be too political. Like Southern University can't say, we endorse whomever for governor, okay? We endorse that Republican, or we endorse that Democrat. Charities are not allowed to do that. That includes churches. But you may know that over the past many years, many big churches have done just that. The IRS doesn't like that, but they really don't have the tools to fight that. And the reason I say that is that about 10 years ago, Senator Charles Grassley wrote a letter to 7 leaders of big churches and said, we would like your rationale for supporting these candidates. They happen to be conservative Republican candidates, and Chuck Grassley's a conservative Republican, so he didn't have any ideological difference with the pastors. It was that they were using their pulpit in order to put this forth. All of them said, I'm going to ignore you. And they did. And after that, nothing much happened. So yes, churches play a very special role in our philanthropic community, but at the same time, we can't find out much about their finances. I'm not sure that's going to change in my lifetime. Anyway, that will be one of the questions that we can answer later on in another generation.
I kind of got a question about the board, because it seems like they have a lot of power in a sense, but they don't get paid much for the responsibilities that they have, like.
Yes, and the question is that the question?
Well, maybe I didn't have a
Okay.
question.
It's an observation, and that's fine. So, they do have a lot of power, okay, and no money.
Okay.
It has once been said that the politics are so vicious at nonprofits because so little is at stake. But it's also true that a lot is at stake, even though these people don't get paid anything. But yes, that is true. Think about that. In fact, it goes the other way. Chantries, right? It goes the other way. In order to be on a board in many charities, it comes with a price tag. You have to pay them. Okay? My wife sits on a board of St. John's University in New York, big basketball school, and good school. And she went there a long time ago, not that long ago, but long ago. And there's a requirement to be on that board. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the requirement, the opening bid is about $1 million per year. Same with the Museum of Modern Art. If you watch CBS Morning on Sundays, they did a nice story. They do nice stories. It's not political at all. It's really like the best of humanity comes out of that. It's just so wonderful. And they did a story on MoMA, and they've just gone through a long reconstruction period. They've just renovated their entire building, and they're opening it up like this week. And so they did a story on that, but that came up. What does it take to be on the board of directors of MoMA? And it's a lot of money. So, and that's true with a lot of organizations. In fact, when you're asked to be on a board, part of this, and you're expected to support the organization. Yeah. And you can see why. Okay, so there's that rationale. That's logical. That's a good thing. That idea is a good thing. But then to put a price tag on it, especially if it's very high, really limits the people and the kind of people you could have on the board. You're not going to have a person who's making $50,000 at an IT place in New York City being on the board of MoMA. It will not happen. Okay, and yet that person's perspective might be truly important. Or the housewife who might not have a job at all. Okay, and I'm not talking about the housewife who's married to a billionaire and therefore doesn't. I'm talking about the housewife who really doesn't have a job and whose husband makes just normal amounts of money. That person's not going to find herself on the board, even though that housewife might be a crucial part of who comes and sees the artwork. So that perspective isn't going to be on the board. This is a problem. I feel very strongly about the diversity of boards, and I don't see the answer to how to get out of it, because boards need the money too. A lot of people give money in expectation of being on the board. Another issue. So
I guess my question is, what's the benefit to the board member then now? Because you're paying a price tag to be on the board and support the institution. But is it then just a power grab for you to say that you have some type of power over that organization or institution? Because they're not going to pay you back, I guess, what you donated. So what?
what's in it for them?
Yeah, other than the gratitude, I guess.
Gratitude's a big deal.
Yeah.
And let's not, I'm so glad you put it that way, because the feeling you get from being on a board of directors is huge. And the thanks you are given by the community is huge, because even though people don't, you go to a party and you say, well, I'm on the board of directors. Wow, that's a big deal.
Right.
And they know it, even though they don't understand the way we're describing it now. That is a big deal. So it's a resume, part of your resume. And I don't say that lightly.
Right.
So let's understand that. I'm feeling like I'm not going as fast as I should, and I don't want to miss anything that I want to get to later. So we have until 4 o'clock, is that correct? Or can we go a few minutes later? You okay with maybe 4:10 or something? Okay. I'm a stickler for time, but I don't want to how about you? I didn't catch you guys. 10 after 4, we're good? I don't want anybody walking out. I will not let, the door is locked, so you keep that in mind. But I will continue on. Here we go. 3 modes of governance, fiduciary. The board is concerned primarily with the tangible assets. And this is how we think of most of our oversight operations. We're in charge of making sure the budget's taken care of, the lights are on. We have the proper leases for our buildings and so forth. Then there's the strategic mode. And we think broadly. We think in terms of what our future is going to look like, what we need to do from a strategic perspective. I mean, you've all heard of the phrase strategic planning, and that's part of what they do. They do that in conjunction with the CEO and other senior staff sometimes. And finally, something that's not talked about a lot is the board that is governing from a generative perspective. And the authors of Leadership as Governance threw this third one in to give us a broader idea of how we look at life. The board provides a less recognized but critical source of leadership of the organization. It's not a hierarchy. It's a triangle. It's a pyramid. All of them are important. Even though type 1 has to come first and type 2 usually comes second and 3 later, they are all important to the success of the governing process. So I did this little exercise. How much does the board contribute in time to the organization? Even I find this to be kind of a vexing calculation, even though it shouldn't be. You assume that the $100,000 person works 40 hours a week, which is 2,000 hours a year. Every hour is $50. So that's how that comes through. So there's a value to a board, a financial value that the board is giving up by virtue of being with you. And then, of course, that doesn't include committee times, because there are committees that these guys have to sit on as well. And sometimes I have to ask, are these guys along for the ride? I mean, do they really care? What we're talking about right now is their responsibilities, but then on the other side of the picture, you have people who really don't get too invested in it. They just come to the meetings sometimes. They sometimes do their committee work, they sometimes don't. They're not really there. And this is another issue. Someone once said that she thought there were about 9 million board seats in the United States on nonprofits. And about half of them were not filled. She was like very concerned about this. I remember telling her, I am too, but I'm actually more concerned about the ones that are filled. Because I don't know if everybody who knows he or she is on a board knows what the responsibilities are. So now, this is important. We'll take a minute here to kind of go through it. Type 1. Remember this from your SATs? No, this is to that, that is to this. Control mechanism. This is a moment ago, we were talking about the fiduciary responsibilities. So it's a controlling process. This is what the board does to control an organization, like these things do, like a dam does to a river. Air traffic control tells pilots what to do. Landlords have rule over their tenants. Now, we go from control mechanism to direction center. In a way that a compass is related to navigation, or to headlights related to a car. I tried to fix this up and I still screwed it up. But anyway, you get the drift here. The flight planner is pilot. So we go from control to direction, and I know you've all gotten ahead of me here. Meaning maker. That's how I believe the ultimate in a board would act. Having been able to deal with the first two. It's not like you can just jump to 3 and say, okay, we're going to go to Kumbaya. We're going to make sure all of this fits. So I'm going to give you some examples now. Anybody have a reaction to that right off the top?
Yeah.
What would that be? It's a good thing, or not?
First thing comes to my mind is liability.
A true type 1 question.
Like who's responsible for this in the event that it's damaged once it leaves the Boston Museum of
Or
Fine
come up
Arts.
missing.
Yeah.
Excellent. What did you say? I'm sorry?
Or come up missing, never returns back, you know.
Yes, come back missing. All right. So we can always see some questions here. Is there a good outcome of this potential? No. Okay. I love it. So what are the issues the board should consider? Now I'm going to put some clothing on the stuff we just went through. This, by the way, is a real situation. You're not going to get, Peter Donor gave $1 million to, this is for real. Okay, from the perspective, are the paintings travelable? Insurance and security arrangements. Equestrian, is there someone who gave it with the condition that it, okay?
Remains.
I don't know what it was. How much would the lunch pay?
See, those are all type 1 questions. One more. All right. Are these all not questions you would come up with ultimately if you're sitting around a board table and said, oh, okay. But we go past that to a strategic level of questioning. That's what I thought you would jump on right away.
Second one was not.
Maybe you were in it anyway, but just didn't say it, because I think that's like the most, whoa. Now, you have to keep in mind, I used to live in Boston for a long time, so I know this for a fact. There are no more snooty people than in Boston, okay? Especially when is anybody else from Boston? Especially when it comes to education and arts. So this is a big deal. Should the MFA sponsor tie-ins? Okay, so this is like, okay, if we do this, what are then longer-term consequences going to be? And then we get into the generative mode. Should we be in the business of loaning art to the highest bidder? Is that who we are? Do we want them to go to the masses? I mean, is that what we want? We could go down to Times Square if we want that, right? All right, so I'm going to go back and think about this for a second. Based on those questions, would you have loaned the Monets to the Bellagio? No? Most of you know? How about you? You're young and maybe you have a different view of this. Not that you guys are old, I'm just saying, because I'm older than both of you.
The image, no.
Is
I
that
would
answer?
say, not as many. It said 21. I was thinking more maybe like 5 or 6.
Okay, that's a good, see, this is why you have this is what you need in a board. They're like, who said 21 was the number? Maybe, would 5 or 6 make a difference to you, given all of the other questions that might come up?
Yeah, I mean, it's lower security risk than all 21, and then that might bring people to the museum in Boston because we can advertise, come see the other 20 that we have if you like these 5 or 6.
Okay, good, like that, I like that. You were saying something.
Yeah, I kind of agree with her too, but I'll be a little bit iffy about the risks involved.
If you about the what?
About the risk that's involved.
The risks, yes.
Yeah. But, I
What do you
mean,
think
to
they did?
compromise, they were kind of,
What do you think this snooty board did? All of them had, I'm sure, pay $1 million to be on the board, but what do you think they did?
It depends on the answers that I got from those questions. All those are valid questions. I guess without knowing the answers, I couldn't make a decision just yet.
Okay.
My take would be that they would probably say no. Maybe it was, they looked at it as mission drift. Like, okay, so we are all about art and, and everything like that, but nowhere in our mission doesn't say that, we're getting into the business of loaning out artwork, setting up exhibits, elsewhere, assuming all of these different liabilities that we wouldn't otherwise assume if we just stick to what we're supposed to be doing, what we said we're gonna do in our mission.
I love it, because that's exactly the kind of question that needs to be asked. And it was answered, and the Monets went to the Bellagio.
They did?
They did.
Oh,
They did.
wow.
The financial
about
terms were,
growth.
I'm sorry?
I was thinking in terms of growth, just it more of the what's in it for me type thing. If you're looking to brand and capture the audience and get donors, so on and so forth, and you can be assured that the risk and liability is lower than anything, you know, and everything is offset, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But without knowing how they answered and what was negotiated, I couldn't say how they would have went.
Exactly.
And then who
What
knows
would
what's
really-
going on?
Correct.
And no telling what was going on at the Bellagio at that time for them to want those paintings to be there.
Yeah, it was not as family-friendly a place as it is today. This is back in the early 90s.
Yeah.
That's another issue, by the way.
Yeah.
I would love to know the inside story of all of that, to go at what you were just saying, because let's say, did it increase fundraising, for example? Did it do anything to help the organization from a financial perspective? Okay, here's another example. Another real example. Vanderbilt, a little closer to home here. Wanted to get more Jewish students in. What are the issues? Again, type 1 questions. Well, that I think is a really good question. Is it legal? Is it something that the law would allow? And then there's the kind of the tangible questions about other programs being affected, how many more people we need, and what will the facilities cost. Then we go to the strategic, other questions that come up. So you can see, I hope, we've kind of looked at this from a couple of different angles here, this 3-level approach to governance: fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And now we're on the strategic again. You can see it's a broader way of looking at how we should answer this question. Should we do this or not? And finally, generative, which I find the real exciting stuff to be on the generative side of things. And going back to what Robert said a moment ago about being consistent with core values, it says here, but the mission too, that part of our mission. Remember that the premise was that they wanted to raise their ranking in, I guess it was in the U.S. News and World Report. And the question would be, what's the benefit of that? Is that all we're doing? So, are there any questions regarding this particular part of it? Because this is a good basis to think about what we're going to talk about next. And I wanted to give you this because I don't believe we talk about this enough. I know that at BoardSource, where I used to do some work about a decade ago for some years prior to that, they talk about this a lot. It's one of the best organizations for board information that exist. And I believe that every board needs to have a tune-up every once in a while from outside people. And I do that, but I think there's a lot of others, and BoardSource is really great. So, but the point is that we need to start thinking about these kinds of things in ways that we haven't. Yeah.
So, coincidentally, I actually ended up on BoardSource maybe 2 weeks ago, and the recommendation was that board members receive some type of, be that training, some type of a session along these lines, just in keeping current with their board management. How is it that, you paint that picture to a current board member who may feel as though, oh, I'm seasoned, I've done this, I've served on several different boards in several different capacities. What's the benefit to them to keep up with this constant training and professional development? Because it's obviously necessary with things constantly changing, and not just the nonprofit sector, but for the universities as well and higher education. What's the benefit to them, in pushing them to say that, hey, you need to do this on an annual basis, at least once, even if you don't have new people?
Yes. The first thing I would do is be sure you honor their experience, their wisdom, and that the message is not that this past 20 years of your life now is all of a sudden irrelevant, because it is not irrelevant at all. You want to honor that, and you want to build upon it. taking into account some realities. One of the big realities at universities is online education. That has changed in the last 10 years tremendously. What does that mean?
Right.
What does that mean to our facilities program? I remember going through my high school's library, which is one of the most beautiful libraries ever. And one of the other people in the tour said, what is a library being used for these days? And these are questions that boards need to answer on the generative level. What are we as a university? Who are we as a university? One of the issues that I had at Columbia was we were going more and more online at our master's program. And yet, my way of teaching is like this. I can feel you, I can look at you, I can see your body language. You can ask questions. In a way, even the people who are online right now cannot, even though they're part of it. So, is there a value in that doesn't exist online? I would say yes, but that's an answer that I would give. So let's say we do both at Southern University. How does that look? So all of these things are issues that boards haven't had to deal with before. And it's not a matter of them not having experience and not knowing what they're doing. This is a changing world. So that's how I would approach it. We need to do this. And Board Source is right, they should do it every year. Every year. Every year. It sounds like a lot, but it's not, especially when things change, especially so quickly right now.
If I may add, one thing that we did with ours, we made it mandatory, so it was in the bylaws, so if you want to be a board member, that's an expectation of you, that you have to go through annual training. Because
There you go, Robert. Make it mandatory.
I love that answer.
Nothing else matters, it's in the bylaws.
You signed up for
You
this.
signed up for it.
I wrote a book some years ago about ethical decision-making in nonprofits, and decided there were four, in my view anyway, four big pillars to ethical decision-making. And a lot of what we just went through kissed on ethical decision-making, even though a lot of it was clothed in legal language, it was about ethical decision-making. And everything we do when it comes to some consequence in life is about ethical decision-making, believe me. I'm going to give you an example here, and I'll go through this quickly. The William Brown was a boat that left Liverpool in 1841 on its way to Philadelphia, and it sank. There were two lifeboats, and not everybody was on the lifeboat, a little bit like the Titanic. A lot of the people on the William Brown died. There were two lifeboats, one of which started to leak and sink. And there were about this many people on it. There were about some 20-some people. And when it started to sink, because there was so much water on board, and it was raining, and because the people on it were collectively too heavy, it was decided that some people had to go over. Some people had to die. When the survivors were rescued the next day, as it turns out, they all went back to Philadelphia, and somebody brought suit against one of the people who was in that boat, one of the captain's people, one of the crew members in the boat. And it became known as the United States versus Holmes. Holmes was that crew member, and he was responsible for throwing some people overboard. And the legal accusation was that he had murdered these people. He was on trial for murder. The question is, and I'll leave this with you for the next 45 minutes, would you have voted if you were on that jury to find him guilty or not guilty of murder? Remember, he threw people overboard. So keep that question in mind as we go forward. As I say, it's called the United States versus Holmes. It's a real case. Okay, so we have a dilemma. We talk about ethical dilemmas a lot. What does that mean? It means where there's no clear-cut answer. Remember earlier we were talking about how there's sometimes not a right answer? Okay, well this is all the more true when it comes to ethical dilemmas. Dilemma is the operative word. A dilemma means there could be two equally bad outcomes, but one of them has to be chosen. Now let's think about who we are as individuals. I don't think anybody here would disagree with those ideals. We all want to be honest, we all want to be responsible, we all want to respect other people, we think fairness is good and we think compassion is good. Anybody, I mean, maybe I shouldn't go so quickly. Anybody think any one of those things is a bad thing? No, of course you don't. And yet sometimes they can come into conflict with one another. There was once a guy by the name of Lord John Fletcher Moulton who said this: obedience to the unenforceable. That's what sometimes I think of as ethics, the world of ethics. He did a talk in the late 1800s in England, and someone took notes, and those notes were compiled into an article that was published in Atlantic magazine in 1924. How do we think about ethical decision making? Because many people think that, oh gosh, when I talk about ethics or when I hear about ethics, I know what's right. I know what my mother taught me. I know what's in my gut. I know what I learned at church. I know what's right. But I'm here to ask you that if you and I came to a question the same way, your gut might be different from what my gut is telling me. Your mother might be telling you something different from what my mother would be telling me. How do you and I come to an agreement or to an understanding, or you and I? That's the key thing here. So, John Fletcher Moulton decided to look at the issue this way. We have a part of our society which is defined by law. You cannot drive through the red light. There's a law against it. You can't kill someone. There's a law against it. It's a whole bunch of laws in our country, okay? And so it defines what we can't do, and therefore, by extension, what we can do. And then there's another part of our society where there is no law. For example, what are you going to have for dinner tonight? Is anybody in authority going to tell you you can have meat instead of pasta or fish instead of meat? No. Is anyone going to tell you you can't go to the movies? No. There's a part of your life that doesn't matter to anybody else and that's not covered by law. But then there's this place in the middle where there is no law, but it does matter to people. And that's where we have to find manners. That was really what John Fletcher Moulton's article was really all about. Manners. How do we get along? And he used the example of the Titanic. He said, you know, all these guys said women and children first. Knowing they were going to die, they said women and children. Knowing the men were going to die, the men said women and children first. There was no law saying that had to be, okay? But there was an understanding of what was right. So with that in mind, we have to understand that ethics and decision-making in that world is in that kind of very vague area. But what do we mean by that? How do we go about it? So this is not my thinking alone. I have come to these 5 or 6 points here as a compilation of the thinking of many people. So when I say this, do not think this has my signature on it other than my endorsement, but not my, I didn't make this up. The first thing to do is gather as much information as you can as possible. And by the way, think of this through the board's lens, because it always comes up to the board. Not just the information you want to know, but everything that's relevant to the situation. See what existing rules apply. See what other people did in similar circumstances in the past. Because past thinking means a lot. That doesn't bind you to what you're going to do now, but it's good to know that 20 years ago when this kind of situation came up, this is what happened. Then find out if you are in a bad situation because you have a conflict of interest. And if you do, don't be a part of the decision. You don't want to be a favored person. You don't want your view to be favored because it's your view. Thinking through things is crucial. It can't be just a knee-jerk reaction to a question. You have to think through it. This is why it takes a group, and this is why it takes some time. Be reflective, and then, of course, implement the decision. Because we can talk about it all we want in an environment like this, which is very nice. We are in a place where we can think and talk in a way that, Holmes didn't have the opportunity to do when his boat was sinking. So when tough questions come up, we have to then understand that we might not make the right decision, and we have to do it on the fly, and we have to be sure that we let people know that we'll change our mind if need be. And I have to really emphasize this because coming out of Columbia and NYU, and I love the university setting, and I know you guys do too. And so I want us to all think about this. Ethics is an intellectual exercise as much as it is a feeling. Don't get me wrong. But look at this quote. State a moral case to a plowman and a professor. Same thing. The former will decide it as well as, and often better than, the latter, because he has not been led by artificial rules. He's not been led astray by artificial rules. This really rings true because many times when we have an education, we know a lot about something, we, by definition, are restricted to what we already know. That's why I say, okay, maybe 5 or 6 instead of the 21. You had no idea that you're like, who said 21 was a magic number? 5 could have been a great number. So it's that kind of thinking that we need. Who said this, by the way? Said a lot of good things. Okay, so this is a real situation. All of these are, but you might go to a woman who doesn't have her faculties. Children don't want you to talk to her about a charitable gift. How do we deal with that? This is not a black and white situation. Because, a woman who wants to make a gift to us, we want to go and find out what it is. And we don't want to walk away saying you can't make a gift to us because we think you're mentally incompetent to make that decision. At the same time, we don't want to force the gift either. So we want to go through a process to find out the best way to get that information. And it could be that the gift is not made, but it also could be that the gift is made because a donor is still in charge of his or her own destiny. All of these bullet points are right out of my files. How do we handle dilemmas internally? Because when you go out and you say, oh, I got this gift, or I've got this problem, or whatever it is, and you come back and talk about it in the office, you gotta have some sort of process by deciding these things. In perpetuity. Now, that's a phrase that's found in many, many gifts. And that's a phrase that should never be in any gift. Ever. Why is that? Do we know what the word in perpetuity means? Do we know what perpetuity means? What does it mean? What does it mean to you?
I don't know.
Okay. Anybody?
Ongoing in the future.
Ongoing into the future. What's the deadline? What's the end point of that future when it comes to perpetuity? There isn't one. That's the idea behind perpetuity. Forever. And forever is a concept we cannot understand. It's like infinity. We can say that's what it is, but we can't really own it. We don't understand what that means. We're on this earth for 70 years, 90 years or something. That's nothing compared to the ages of the earth. All right, so how do we go about this? It's going to come down to policies. Examine ethics as we have today, not as right versus wrong, but right versus right. Incorporate values instead of judgments. Keep learning. I had a situation once where a woman was accused and she was guilty of stealing from an organization. And the question is whether to fire her or not. And many people wanted to fire her immediately, but some people said, well, I don't know, maybe we should give her a second chance. So I was brought in not to make the decision about whether to fire her, but to help them walk through the process of their own values. And basically what it came down to was I was able to identify this, that they were really arguing about values that they weren't defining. Those two values being judgment versus mercy. Both of those values are good. Those are not bad values, but sometimes they can come in conflict with one another, and that, in this case, they did. And so this is what you're going after here. So understand that there's no right answer, and there's probably no wrong answer. So they had to come to terms with, this is our value system. Okay. The question behind ethics is not so much what's right in terms of an answer, it's an understanding of what your value system is. And competing values don't make either value wrong. This is why it's going to go on forever and ever. Let me just say right off the top, we're never going to preempt ethical dilemmas. But we can be better prepared to deal with them. This is important to understand. That's why it's an ongoing, vibrant process. Sometimes organizations that put together policies do so and then put the policies on a shelf and that's that, and they feel like, oh, we've done our job. But the real job is in the implementation of them. The real job is in the ongoing addressing of issues and updating them. It's not a stagnant document. The training is ongoing, and I'm really impressed that that's part of the laws there. A couple of real examples, maybe you've heard of this, of some of these. The family of the Pearsons pledged $100 million to the University of Chicago. They want their money back. They gave about $21 million so far. The Chicago Maroon broke the story. This is the student newspaper. The Pearsons said that their money wasn't being used the way they wanted it to be. They were establishing a center at the business school, at the School of Public Policy, and it was going to be called the Pearson Institute, and within the Pearson Institute was going to be an ongoing forum every year. And the Pearsons, after 2 years, decided they weren't doing anything they needed to do. All sorts of little questions about that. And then the family said this in their defense, in their lawsuit. They said, we're disappointed. We have no other course of action. The lawsuit, which is not a private document, you can find it online, they say they feel that this is a cautionary tale. And if there weren't a more cautionary tale, I don't know what would be, but they're going after it with vigor. I've just talked recently with the attorneys for the family, and they want to take it to trial. The trial date is September 2020. Another example, have you heard of this one? The Princeton University case, 2002. Bill Robertson, the son of the donor, said that the money his parents gave to establish an endowment at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University was not being used well. That's him right there. And just as an aside, that's about as good a picture you'll ever have of him. He never smiles. These are what he said. Job results were disappointing. One of the major reasons the gift was made was to put people into the foreign service in the government. In 1961, the gift was made. Keep that in mind. And finally, she made all the difference in my view. Her name was Jessie Washington. And I wrote a book about this. It's called Abusing Donor Intent. And she played a very major role in this. This is what the family alleged. Princeton's defense was, hey, Woodrow Wilson School is world class. It's a great place. Our graduates are among the best. They're in society's leaders. And by the way, a good number of our graduates do go into public service. Academic freedom, a big deal, and it is. The United States Supreme Court has said that. So there's real precedent for that allegation to be the case. And then finally, there was one question in the deposition where the president at the time was asked if money that was spent on the husband of a professor at Woodrow Wilson School, so he could be on the basketball coach staff, would that be permissible as an expenditure for this fund? And he said yes. He said, of course it is. And of course, most people would say, of course it's not. So there was a lot of back and forth. This is a case that took 6.5 years. It was not settled in court, which is why the Pearsons going forward would be an important landmark. This was settled out of court. The Robertsons paid $45 million. By the way, Princeton did too. They both paid $45 million. In addition to that, Princeton paid $50 million over a 5-year period to establish a new foundation. That original gift established a foundation. By the way, that foundation grew by the time the lawsuit was filed to about $900 million. The original gift was $35 million. He wanted it all taken away from Princeton. Well, that's maybe one of the saddest aspects of it all. I'm sorry, the next one's the saddest aspect. Yes. So, a good idea. Princeton thinks it's continuing. We'll never know. The family was very upset. Spent a lot of money on it. You heard about the Wounded Warrior Project crisis. When you hear this, you think, oh my God, why would a charity do this? Eric Millett, a veteran, he worked at Wounded Warrior Project, he's a spokesperson for the organization, and he said, look, he found out things, he said, you're using our darkest days, to use his phrase, to make money and have big parties. This was on CBS, it was also in the New York Times. Is there one more? Yeah. Warrior was making almost $400 million in donations in 2015 by the time this suit came, before this crisis. Joint cost allocation is a technical term, meaning that basically they were misappropriate. They were putting things into different buckets that they shouldn't have. An excessive salary, donations to another charity, and sitting on too much money. So these are the allegations. I just finished a book on this very point. It's called Wounded Charity. And I thought this was pretty damning. This is not good. The problem is that none of it's true. Let me repeat that.
None of it was found to be true?
None of it what?
None of it was found
That's
to be
correct.
true?
Some things are true, but the question about, let's say, excessive is a question, but that was not true because they looked at different similar-sized organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They did support another charity, but they supported a lot of charities. They just didn't like one of the charities. Sitting on too much money? Anybody have an endowment here?
Yeah, you'd hope so.
Okay, you hope so.
Yeah.
Well, they said, what we're doing is we're taking care of these guys and gals. We're coming home from post 9/11 wars, and they have to be taken care of for life. Those lifetimes might be 60, 70 years long. These are coming back as young people. They wanted to put $1 billion into a trust fund for that purpose. I'll get to that in a minute. But the point is that the New York Times and CBS got it wrong. So it's important that you hear these stories, and I'm all on the side of criticizing charities that are doing bad things. When I first heard that story, I thought, oh my gosh, something terrible is going on here and we need to do something about that. But at the same time, the criticism has to be valid. It's a balancing act here. They used Charity Navigator as one of their resources. I don't know if you've heard of Charity Navigator. It's an evaluator of charities, which I don't think is doing a very good job. They're doing a good job of doing what they do, but what they do does not evaluate charities. They take money, they take numbers and create ratios. So it's not a good evaluator. They say it is. CBS used, I'm gonna go back to one of the points here if I can. Yeah, this overstating joint cost allocation was not being overstated. WWP was in fact using the same methodology the IRS and the Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP, the Bible for the accounting profession, put forth. And Charity Navigator ignored it. They said, we don't take that into account, which upended all of the other numbers, just because they decided capriciously and incorrectly to do that. It was a tragedy. Over the 3 years that followed this crisis, because the CEO and the COO were fired as a result after having done nothing wrong, after that happened for 3 years, the charity lost against what it was projecting to make for those 3 years over $600 million. $600 million. And I have to end on a funny note. I hope it'll bring a smile to your face. This is from the Wall. You'll notice these are all headlines from real stories from real places, and they're about real places and people. Does anybody remember the name J. Howard Marshall? Haverford. This is out of the Wall Street Journal. The most prolonged misadventures in the annals of college fundraising. You want to not do this. Okay, there he is. He has since died. This was in the early 2000s. Very wealthy man. Before the Kochs became really controversial, they were still very rich. He had an interest in that and had millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. Does anybody know that he married Anna Nicole Smith? Yeah. Now you're remembering, yes, somehow that rang a bell. She was 26 years old when he was 89. What do you think she wanted out of this relationship? It's not like it's not secret, okay?
Money.
The love of money, yeah.
Duh. All right, so he was also one of their wealthiest alumni. The problem is here, and this is something I asked earlier what you guys use, Razor's Edge. Be careful of what you put in it, okay? Because the Wall Street Journal got the back and forth, not emails at the time, because they didn't have it at the time, the communications that were put into their fundraising system to document how Haverford was feeling about him. Now, they had reason to feel about him that way because he was not being really honest with them. And he got married to her. She wanted all of his money. There was a son who didn't want that to happen. There was an estranged son who did want that to happen. It was a real mess in court, all right? She has since died. She died, I think, in mid-2000s, 2007, something like that. At age 39, she was in bad shape from a drugs perspective. It was a real mess. I just wanted to point out, this is what she looked like, and just so you see how the happy couple looked, Jim. There's a lot of common there. But this is, I know that's salacious, but this is even more interesting to me. This is what John Coleman, the president of Haverford at the time, said to him. Now, I know that there's a deduction. We all know that there's a deduction, but you don't successfully raise money by saying otherwise it's going to the government. Basically implying that it's just another waste of money. I have to give him credit for that. I really do. How many times can we say we're sorry? So publicly, and so important an issue. They did file a lawsuit. You do not want to go to court in this kind of a situation. That's why your gift agreement has to be pretty well put together. This happens a lot. You've already got that building there. Let's just put your name on it. We've already got a history department. Let's put your name on it. So nothing is changing, okay? And I find that many donors want to make a difference at an organization. And if they say they want to put together a history program that's not there already, they want to do something in addition to what's going on already. So you don't want to just misallocate the money and say, okay, we're going to now pay the light bill with that money that we were using before for the history department. He won his case because basically Haverford was not injured. If they were to take the money, they would still have the building that it was going to go to, that it was going to be. So those are just 4 examples. There are others. And I wanted you to know that this is, all of these situations are board-driven problems. In other words, the board has to know about it and do something about it. You don't want this to be in the New York Times or your local newspapers. So what have we learned here? The Princeton board didn't really understand what was going on. They were given that gift kind of quickly. They were in a campaign, 1961. The Woodrow Wilson School was not part of it. So the question was, should we accept this based on the requirement that we want to send people into the Foreign Service? Doesn't have to be yes or no, but they should have been aware of it. I think gift agreements today, especially significant ones, have to have some appropriate level of specificity. You have to know what's going on. As a university, you have to be able to deliver on your promise. You are only the caretakers. As young as you might be right now, there will be a time when you are no longer here, either at this university or on this earth. And there will be people after you who have to maintain the promises you are making today to these donors. The Wounded Warrior Project was not prepared for this crisis, even though Steve Nardiz, the CEO, begged them to be prepared for a public relations crisis. Not because he could foresee this, but because it's just standard procedure in good organizations. Do not ever act as an attorney, as a fundraiser or anything else. Even if you are an attorney, you cannot play that role with the donor. The donor needs his or her own person to represent himself, or represent him or her. You cannot act in that capacity. Just because you're at Southern University doesn't mean that you're the good guy. You are a good guy. But in a situation like this, as you can see, it becomes very contentious. Haverford. Now, just to put some definition to this, cultivation is when you're dating, stewardship is after you're married, okay? And we get it wrong, don't we? This is just as important, more important than the lead-up. Lead-up's important, don't get me wrong. It's the ongoing stewardship that will make or break your relationship. Bill Robertson told me when I was interviewing him for this, I asked him, is there something that could have prevented this lawsuit, the Princeton lawsuit? He said, yes. And I said, what is that? He said, had they paid more attention to me, had they respected me more.
So it was a matter of principle.
It was a matter of principle. Well, it was a matter of money, but also, no, because on the law level, there was a lot to be argued, and he had a lot of reasoning. But as you can see, after 6.5 years, neither party went away with a win. So there was an important legal question on both sides. But yes, after all of that, it was a matter of principle. Don't ever let that go. You know, you think that after 20 or 25 years of doing this, I could come up with something more tangible, more instantly recognizable, more instantly executable. I can't. It all comes down to trust. It all comes down to being valid and validating, respected and respecting. Almost any of these issues that have been described in the last hour could have been avoided if there had been trust. Not that you're always going to get it, but if you don't try, you're certainly not going to get it. And organizations cannot take the position that because we're the charity, we're therefore the good guys. We can't do anything wrong. That is not a mindset. Again, I can't take credit for this, but I can't find where he said this, but I know he did. This goes back to what's in our gut, what our mama told us, what we learned in our religious experience. We have to go past that. Because if you and I are going to communicate, we can't do it on our own personal level or else we're not going to see each other. You have your opinion, then check it. I find that to be true in every aspect of life, especially today in politics. We are so instant to come to our conclusions that we don't see the goodness. And there is goodness with everybody, even the people you disagree with most. Don't stop with what you believe. That's easy. It's satisfying. It's like comfort food. Go past that. Make yourself work. You may come back to the same belief. Nothing's wrong with that. But go through that process and be honest about it. Finally, when it comes to ethical decision making, who would vote guilty of murder?
Guilty.
Guilty. Yes?
He's guilty of that, but he also saved lives, so.
A little up in the air, aren't you? Okay, yes, down here. Guilty or not?
I need more details. I couldn't say. He was looking to get the good outweigh the bad. What was the outcome? What was the goal? You know.
No, you're right. You're right. You know, you said that a few times today, and I just want to make sure, this is Tony, right? There is a built-in flaw to the process of this kind of education. There's no way to go around it. There's always a need for more information. Remember, that was the number one thing we need to do with ethical decision-making? You are so right. There is a ton of other information that might help you make your decision. That said, we can't go into every detail and so forth, but in order to get a lesson out of this, we can see that there's some, except for I can see a real no here, but most of the time I get hands up with yes and hands up with no, and then the majority are, I can't figure this out because, yay, he was guilty, but so many lives were saved. Well, that's very much one of the ethical principles of the world. It's either absolute or it's the best for everybody else. You know, what's the best for the common good? The jury was a little bit divided too. They ended up bringing down the charge from murder and fining him for $15 and putting him in jail for 30 days that he didn't have to serve. Because they were just so divided. Why? Because 20 people were alive because of what he did. 7 people are dead because of what he did. Whoa, you don't want to be on that jury. It's not an easy thing, but these are the kinds of questions we have to deal with all the time. That's what these board members who get paid so much are paid the big bucks to decide. Does anybody remember those words? Everybody knows those words. Probably the most famous beginning of any speech in the history of the world. What speech is that?
Is that the Gettysburg?
It is the Gettysburg Address. Why are they so important? These are the opening words of the most important speech in the history of the United States. What do they mean? Let's go through this. What does 77 years mean?
47 or 407?
47, 407, so we're kind of like a bit apart on that. Any guidance here? Okay, any guidance there? Now, I know, Robert, you know the answer, so I'm not going to call on you. You're kind of a ringer on this, because we did this last year. But I can tell you that every time I do this, I get the same reaction. How am I, okay. This is a biblical term, a score. A score of years is used in the Bible. It means 20 years. So this would mean 87 years. So now we have, in order to know what the Gettysburg Address was about, we have to begin here. Because I don't think we can understand fully what the Gettysburg Address was really all about until about 2 minutes from now, because I want to tell you. But 67 years is therefore how many years? 87 years. Okay. Another piece of information that you need in order to fully get this is the date when, the year anyway, when the Gettysburg Address was delivered. Does anybody know that?
Give me a second, I can Google it.
No. This is the problem in today's classrooms. I love it. All right. I'm going to pause just there for a moment. What do you think he was referring to? Clearly, what he was referring to is a pretty big deal. What was he referring to? What thing? What happened that many years prior to his doing the speech?
Some of our forefathers and.
Has something to do with our history there. Yeah.
Was it the Constitution?
The Constitution.
Everybody says the Constitution, of course. That's the beginning of our country, right?
1776.
No. Constitution wasn't 1776. Constitution was 1787.
1787, yeah.
No, but we've got a problem developing here, don't we? Do you think 1776 is in play? Why do you do that?
Because that's what I was always.
All right. Well, I'm going to hold your thought there for a moment. But you said the Constitution. Almost everybody says the Constitution. Now, we're going to add that extra detail in. November 19, 1863, the date of the Gettysburg Address. 1863. Subtract 87 from 1863. Mary? What year?
Oh, I haven't done it yet.
No, you don't have to. You had it.
1776.
Bingo!
Yeah, that's what I thought it was.
You did.
1776.
So what did happen in 1776?
That's when our papers were signed.
That's in what?
That's when our country was incorporated.
No, it wasn't. It would be nice if it were, but it wasn't. Our country was incorporated, technically speaking, on June 21st, 1788, when New Hampshire ratified the Constitution. But that's another issue.
Ratification, maybe?
No, the ratification was then. The
Okay,
Constitution Convention was in 1787.
okay.
He's not referring to the Constitution. This is the key thing that I need to get across here. He was not referring to the Constitution. He was referring to the Declaration of Independence.
That's right.
Okay?
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
He was not making,
Declaration of Independence.
you know, when I wrote a book called The Art of Planned Giving a long, long time ago.
56 years old, remember the mind. It's not as sharp as it used to be. I remember the year.
A long time ago, in The Art of Planned Giving, I talked a lot about ethics. Because we need to deal with people on an ethical level. It's not all legal. Even though there's a lot of legal stuff in planned giving. And somebody wrote back and said, ethics is the nice underbelly of the real world. In other words, he was saying ethics isn't that important. The real stuff is, you know, the law and math and so forth. And I remember having the reaction that it's the other way around. Ethics is the real world. Ethics is really the most important thing of the real world. Murder didn't become illegal before it was unethical. Okay? It became illegal after it was unethical. All of our laws are based on our ethical understanding of good behavior. So, what was he doing in this speech? What he was doing was he was taking this opportunity, which was just a few months after the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, to say, we are met on this battlefield. And these guys, they were all guys at the time, gave their lives so that this republic could endure, okay? And so, what did that mean? The republic is going to endure not based on the Constitution. And why not? What was the big issue in the Civil War? The big issue was slavery. What is the big issue? What was the big birth defect of the Constitution? It promoted slavery. It provided for slavery. It promoted the bringing in of additional slaves for 20 years. So the Constitution would be a bad model for his argument. What would be a good model? The Declaration of Independence, in which Jefferson and a few other people on the committee wrote, all men are created equal. How could you have all men are created equal in the same country where we're going to allow slavery? This just does not make sense. Now, the reason it happened was it was all political, and we've got a whole history of compromises. Okay, I get that. But the point is that he did not rely on a legal document, our Constitution, for his argument. He relied on what I would call our ethical birth. When the country was, as you would say, begun through the Declaration of Independence, because it put together our values as a country. So I'm thinking if Lincoln can rely on ethical decisions for saving the country, then maybe we should put some more meat into our own ethical decision-making process in all of the big issues in our own lives. This is the message I give to boards. This is the message. We go through the entirety of it. We need to look at board governance differently. There's strategic, fiduciary, generative. We look at how that plays out with different questions, like for example at the MFA and at Vanderbilt. We then say what's obvious. What we're really talking about is ethical decision-making. So let's go there. Look at how that plays out. Look at some of the problems that have come about because organizations haven't been doing their work, stewarding donors, making sure that their own houses are kept up in order internally. All of this is of a piece. And this, at the end, is why it's of a piece. It's important. And so that's our conversation about board governance for today. Any questions?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Robert will tell you that if you would like to answer and have any questions that don't come up right now, to feel free to touch base with me. Okay? Won't you tell him that? He will tell you my emails. He'll give you my contact. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to address?
Pat yourselves in the back. You all are getting certificates with 2 CFRE points. So if you are going for your CFRE, it's definitely going to be beneficial in that. The rest of the classes that we are doing for the rest of this year are all pretty much targeted towards board members. One thing that I would say is that even if you aren't a board member, these classes are very beneficial because you will be working with board members. And what better way to navigate those relationships and understanding their responsibilities. The one coming up next will be led by FCC, and that's on prudent practices for fiduciaries and trustees. Definitely looking forward to seeing some of you all there. But no, I just want to thank Doug again for coming out and giving a round of applause.
Great. Thank you.
I was so impressed with the class last year that I just figured that we had to get him back. And I would definitely like to see more board members participating in these classes. Board Source, just like he said, it's recommending that these board members are trained at least once a year. Practices, policies, all those different things change. We saw that with the tax laws with nonprofit organizations, so we have to ready ourselves for that. But thank you all again for coming. Any questions you may have, I want to make sure I get all of your contact information out where I can share the PowerPoint with you and get your information as far as getting your certificates to you. I'm going to have those printed and I want to make sure that I can get those to you in a timely fashion. Also, go on to CFRE and start your application. The sooner the better. Start thinking about what your nonprofit project will be as well. You do your first name, last name, and email. Oh, that's you.
Oh my gosh, it was a lifesaver. As you can see, I was just struggling there, and the tea comes in and everything changed.
And you want to
Take
talk
that
about
board back into action.
Yeah, let me, okay. This is the book called Wounded Charity.
Okay.
I feel awkward because I don't normally do this, but I spent 3 years on it, full-time,
Okay.
other than when I came here to talk. And it tells the story of how Wounded Charity was accused of many of the things we saw on the screen, and what the story was behind the story. Why CBS and why the New York Times got it wrong, and the consequences of the whole thing. But it's written in a narrative way, it's not a textbook. You know, it's about real issues, and it brings in other issues that involve the VA, the Veterans Administration, which is the organization that the government has in order to help veterans. It's gone through a lot of issues these last 100 years, but on top of that, even if they didn't have any real issues, there still wouldn't be enough to do what's necessary to help our veterans. The key thing is to know that I come at it from this perspective. One is that we need to criticize charities. We need to criticize charities. We have to be ever vigilant to know what's going wrong in a charity. I feel very strongly about that. I feel that the nonprofit sector is far too important to just let it go and have these charlatans come in. And there are charlatans. That's number one. So I am quick to say there's something wrong with a charity if something seems wrong. That said, the second point is that criticism needs to be founded in some experience and wisdom. Criticism here was accepted because of our willingness to accept that charities aren't always doing the right things. So it's important that we understand where the criticism is coming from. A story cannot be untold. I'm not trying to untell the story, but I'm trying to tell it from a different perspective. And I have the facts on my side. 3, this was not a story that criticized Wounded Warrior Project. Wounded Warrior Project is a great organization. The criticism is with the board. It's with the board. In my view, the board was fully responsible for creating the crisis and for not addressing the crisis when it came up. That's why it's included here. It's a board problem. A lot of people are getting help from Wounded Warrior Project, and many of those people I spoke with, they were concerned that because the book was coming out that they might not get the same kind of support because of that, because of their willingness to talk with me. And so I had to keep that in mind. A lot of people talked to me confidentially, but even those who didn't, I said, you don't have to worry, that's not the kind of organization WWP is. If you are interested in veterans and you want to support them, please continue to. That's another issue. They do not have the same vision as they did before. I think Steve and Al were just tremendous visionaries. What they have now is kind of a caretaker board, and they're dealing a lot more with the VA and the DoD, the Department of Defense, more in a way that doesn't help the organization, but helps the DoD. But more important than anything else, is that this book was written for veterans. Veterans, in my view, and you'll see this in the book, are the most honored citizens in our country. And so to hurt them, as this decision did, $600 million translates to lost services. Their long-term trust has stopped being funded as a result. That long-term care that was going to be taking place, it probably will continue, but not in the same way. So a lot happened. A lot of bad things happened. And it all comes down to why or how the veterans are being helped and not helped. WWP isn't the only organization that's helping veterans. There's thousands of them. If you're interested in the veterans cause, and if you know other organizations that help and you want to support them, please do. But also continue to support VSO, I call them the Veteran Service Organizations, WWP as well. They're still a very solid organization. Even though they lost so much money, they went from a $400 million operation to about 250. I think they'll grow back, but as I said, it'll be a different vision. But this is the story of that. It's about the story. It's like something interesting. It's a news story. But on top of that, it's lessons learned for nonprofit executives, for donors, and for veterans. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
And that definitely may be something that we discuss in the future. Not to slight us in any sort of way, but we are very accustomed to PR crises. Not the foundation, but just the system as a whole. Being able to show our leaders the way to properly, navigate those, how to prepare for it, as opposed to it just being like an impulse reaction to, go out and do something about that. I think that may be some relevant course material we can discuss in the future too.
Well, it is. In fact, I was talking to someone else last week, and she said, having read your book, what you're really doing is you're talking about crisis management.
That's what I got from that.
Did you? And I said, I thought it was about governance, and it is, but she said, no, it's what's speaking to me right now is how you walk through the crisis management question on this. And charities need that all over the place.
Yeah.
So it's not just good governance, or I guess that's not a way to put it, but within good governance, there's crisis management. It's a headline of this activity. And as I said, the CEO asked the board to prepare itself for this kind of thing, not this, but something, and they didn't do it. And they did not have an action plan. And then another one of the issues was that once the news stories broke, it was CBS Evening News, 3 stories in 2 days, front page of the New York Times. This was not nothing. And the board said, well, we're not going to talk to anybody. We're not going to allow you, Steve, to talk to them.
You have to respond within at
Let's
least 24 hours.
let everybody else take control of this narrative. Well, the problem was, as you'll see in the book, it goes far deeper than just that. The crisis was manufactured by one of the board members. Let's go there. Talk about duty of loyalty care.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you this much. I had a letter ready to go to the attorneys general in Florida, Virginia, and New York, asking those people to be taken off the board. Didn't do it because the time passed. I just didn't have the bandwidth to make that happen from a legal perspective. But I do ask the question if the board should have recused themselves completely from doing any work. Anyway, there it is. It's on Amazon. You go to your local bookstore, they'll order it, but
Thank you.
you're good if you got it. Thank you.
That would be a good section.
I do have a question.
Yes.
How do you think the technology with the charity and fundraising is gonna affect the future of it? Like websites like GoFundMe and stuff like that.
Tremendously. We gotta be on top of that. We have competitors and we have assistants.
I've been thinking about
We
the
have both of
second
those in the
option.
world of technology. So
But like I
we
said,
want to be sure that we
PhD
use
out the
them
way.
to our advantage.
Like,
But the world is changing.
that's what I
When I was
am
doing
trying to do. Like
funding
the
in the
masters took
80s.
so much out of me though. Like
Yeah.
I like literally fighting
Because
people.
people are raising like $4,000 in seconds.
Not here.
Yes, they
But
are. So the
I do want to
question is,
pick your brain on
how do you
something.
differentiate your
but,
mission and whatever you're doing from all of that?
pick your brain on
Because that's
something
money that's
involving
going away that
something
they can have.
because I know your experience. Like
And yet, it's a good idea.
I wanna.
Funding.
Right.
It's a
I
great
want to
idea.
navigate that very
I
carefully.
get started,
I want
right?
to. I want to navigate.
Does it help you
I want to
for
navigate it very
No, it
carefully
doesn't.
because I'm not.
I think what's going to happen is it'll
No,
settle
just
down
tell us
like a lot of
about
things in
that last,
technology.
what
How
was
we
that,
deal with it
yesterday?
at the beginning.
So I'm not.
To understand that
I will be.
this
too.
will take care of an
I'm
immediate
not- I don't
short-term
wanna
need.
get- I don't-
It's not gonna cost
but,
that much money.
I just want.
I think most,
But,
the example that comes to mind is,
so you work here?
Yes.
there was a guy who wanted to fund.
He's the original Robert.
Yeah.
Another Robert.
Philip,
Philip, when she
Okay.
called me that day, I spoke to Robert, I didn't even think the other Robert, right.
Go fund me. Okay? And he raised millions of dollars for it. The problem is he's turned out to be a fraud. It wasn't just that he was conservative, he was raising money wrongfully. The GoFundMe page was stopped. And so-
a couple of different things.
And so you don't want that kind of, so
Alright.
the person who's
All
doing
right,
the funding.
I'm about to head over, cause I gotta get some other stuff out the
I
way.
think we've come to a point.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm glad you did.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So I think we're going to have to develop protocols around that kind of process. The technology allows us to do.
No,
all these
she's
things.
not.
It's us humans.
Oh,
that
no,
do
she's
it.
not. But let me tell you what it
Yeah,
is.
go for it.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Taking this next.
Okay, keep going.
so she comes around quite often
Trying to find a way, huh?
just
Trying to be relevant?
finding ways and like, I'm like, okay, well,
To be relevant.
I'm like, here, we have these courses coming up, if you wanna circulate these to your network, I would appreciate it. Essentially, you're doing what an e-blast does for me, but, it was kinda like taking in the context that she was like doing
Working.
marketing for us,
Correct.
and that's not marketing. But we'll chat, we'll talk offline.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you again. I enjoyed your presentation.
Mary? Mary, right?
I'm Tony.
Tony, I'm so sorry.
That's good.
Thank you so much,
Anytime. I appreciate it.
and love those glasses.
Look, I didn't want to be rude. They know my light sensitivity issues. I have
Yeah.
photophobia and whatnot. And I was like, I had to keep looking down just to kind of get the balance. I didn't want you thinking I was ignoring you or whatnot. But the bright lights, I can't take
I
them.
don't know why.
Well, I still love the glasses.
But thank you. I love my aviators.
We're gonna dim them for you next.
I'm saying they're, a little late now.
Yeah.
I didn't realize we had a dim right here, Robert.
I forget sometimes.
Well, Tony, good to meet you.
Same. I appreciate it, Robert. Keep me posted. I'll be at the next one.
Definitely will.
All right, y'all have a good one.
This is for you.
I still feel compelled to go on Amazon and order it, but
Please do,
I
but
really appreciate
for
this.
you.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
I was definitely looking forward to it. I remember you saying that you were wrapping up with it. It was earlier in the year when we spoke.
That's right. I was wrapping up that part of the writing of it, and then, oh gosh, it's been a journey.
So how did let's see. We are going to. I'm just gonna ask him the best way to do it, just to make sure we don't lose anything.
Okay.
Because I did it last time and
You lost it.
I lost it completely. So
Well, look, be in touch. I'd love
Definitely.
to come back, and I don't know how you're growing, but let me be a part of it if you want. There are a lot of, the reason I was asking you about how the Valdry Center is growing is I know it needs money, and I don't know what kind of programs you're putting together, and so just let me know if I can be of any help.
absolutely. And so that as we get that advisory board together, because we would be in the process of writing their bylaws, I want to stick that in there because I'll have to go back and kind of like push for it to get put into the foundation's bylaws and the university's bylaws for their board members. The Valdry Center, since I think they're still so very new, it's an opportunity to get it put in there. I definitely want to make that mandatory for them.
Well, it sounds great. You're doing something really, I think, different, and I wish you the best. Now, how many people do you have on faculty?
Adjunct faculty here,
Like 10? Okay,
Yeah.
that's awesome. And do you offer, I know this course comes for credit for CFRA.
Yeah.
You offer